Between today and January 1, 2023, we have exactly 1,122 days. That means electioneering for the 2023 general elections will begin maybe about 1,000 days from now. But then the political parties will probably have started work well before that time. Beside that is what non-political parties, people like you and I, and a couple of guests that we have in the studio, the responsibilities that we all have to ensure that electioneering in Nigeria is free, fair, credible, and this time around, safe. So have this conversation with us about all the talk we've been having about electoral reforms, all the things that need to be done, and how they need to get done, and who needs to do them. We have joining us in our Lagos studio, former Commissioner for Information in Rivers State, who is also a communication and public services consultant, Mr. Austin George. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Chairman, Council of Legal Education, Mr. Emeka Ngige. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, gentlemen.
In our Abuja studio, we have the Chief Press Secretary to the Chairman of INEC, Mr. Rotimi Oyekomi. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Oyekomi.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Yeah, good. Let's begin with you, Mr. Oyekomi. INEC has been pushing for some reforms, especially there's been the talk about INEC asking for a special court for elections. First of all, what exactly is the exactly is INEC asking for there? Because we understand that it is the responsibility of INEC to prosecute electoral offenders. That hasn't been happening as frequently as it ought, and consequently people feel impunity means that things can continue just the way they are. So on the one hand, what exactly is INEC asking for now? Are you saying that INEC is overburdened?
Thank you very much. We submitted quite a number of proposals to the last National Assembly, the 8th Assembly, and we had firm assurances that the amendment will be concluded. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The back and forth between the presidency and the National Assembly at that time prevented the conclusion of that process. Now we are back to where we started from. And we are quite happy that the current Senate has moved quite swiftly to deal with certain aspects of the issues. There are a whole range of issues, but referring to what you just said concerning the fact that we have to prosecute, before you can prosecute as an election management body, you have to arrest and then you have to investigate. Unfortunately, there is no provision in the law that empowers INEC to arrest and investigate. The only organ that can do that is the Nigerian police. So what we do is to work hand in hand with them to ensure that these culprits are brought to book. Arising from 2019 general elections, we have received some case files, about 16 of them, from the police, and we will now jointly prosecute the culprits, hoping that we'll be able to conclude the case. So we depend on the police to be able to carry out that. But more importantly for us is the need to establish this tribunal to try electoral offenders. And all the committees set up by the federal government, the Oways, the Lemu, and recently the Ken Namani, all of them recommended the establishment of this tribunal. And we are happy that the current National Assembly is well disposed to doing that, and we hope that they will expedite action so that those who commit electoral offenses can be duly arrested and prosecuted and jailed if that's the case.
Mr. Ngige, what's your take on this? One of the perspectives that a number of people will have is, has INEC even justified, the powers it had, of organizing elections and so many other things? Maybe we should ask you, do you think INEC was overburdened? Do you think that law was too cumbersome for just one agency of government to execute?
No, the understanding
I have about the Electoral Offences Commission, as recommended by Uwe's panel, is that it will be distinct from INEC.
No. I'm talking about the law as is, the INEC,
The Electoral
Act as is. Do you think it's too much? It's too humongous for INEC to?
No, the law as it is not too much for implementation. It's just the Nigerian factor. It's a big factor.
What do you mean?
Nigerian factor is that INEC will prepare for an election, prepare for how materials will be distributed along the line. After all the efforts they have made, including where the materials will sleep with the electoral officials, then some people are hijacked by politicians. They divert the materials for either thumb printing or for other purposes. That is a Nigerian factor. INEC will never have prepared that his material will be diverted by his own staff, ad hoc staff it appointed.
That's electoral malpractice. I mean,
Yes.
in the law, it's not called the Nigerian factor, pretty much.
You can't see any law where you can see Nigerian factor. We in Nigeria know that there is a Nigerian factor in all our activities.
So where do you think the root of this came from?
It's systematic.
Which system?
The Nigerian system, from top to the ground.
Mr. George, please rescue us. I really don't understand. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think that we need to worry about the quality of our electoral and political process. A situation where over 200 and something billion naira is spent for an election, and the outcomes are always very contentious, very controversial, and even discredited. We've now arrived at a point where major decisions about who is legitimate, for a certain office is decided not by the people anymore, but by the courts. So I think that we need to have a very serious national conversation concerning the quality of what we call our democracy. I think it's also tempting to blame INEC exclusively for what is going on. You could accuse them of partisanship. You could accuse them of manifest incompetence. But if you look at the electoral and political spectrum, all the actors appear to be behaving badly. You don't seem to have credible, acceptable internal primaries conducted by parties. And you find that these, contentions, very controversial internal processes of the parties end up even in courts before the matter even gets into the electoral vote. So I think that we need to have a very serious conversation about what kind of democracy do we want? Because what we have now is far from even a textbook definition of what democracy is. So it seems to me that the matter is a very broad and complex one. We need to make sure that INEC rises to the challenge of organizing, very credible and acceptable elections. And then we also need to make sure that the parties internalize the fact that they can't choose who their leaders should be arbitrarily. They must be able to follow predictable, legally acceptable processes for choosing their leaders. We don't have any of these. And so the key components that ought to make democracy what it ought to be are missing. All these people who act in the spectrum, in the electoral and political spectrum, are not acting well. And so what we have is this kind of disaster upon disaster every time we have an electoral season. So I think we need to have a very frank and intellectually honest conversation. Remember that the last, one of the elections, I think it was the 2003 election that brought President Yar'Adua. Even if eventually the Supreme Court, 2007 election, even if the Supreme Court certified the election in his favor, he had the moral and intellectual honesty to say, look, the election should have been better organized. And I think that was the beginning of what we later saw as the electoral reform that led eventually to 2015. We need to have that kind of intellectual honesty to say, look, we need to have a better process.
Now, speaking of that conversation, I came across something quite interesting this few days, and it's a student union body in a Nigerian tertiary institution. They're about to conduct elections tomorrow, and they're employing the electronic method, and it was good. It made sense. That's the University of Ibadan. And it hit me that maybe the approach we're going about this should be reviewed. Maybe the conversation should start from the bottom up. I remember you said top to bottom earlier. So maybe the people should actually own this reform. Let the people say, this is how we want our elections to be done, such that we see a reduction in voter apathy. Because if the people don't own the process, they won't exactly go out to vote. So maybe, what do you think? How should we go about this? Is it bottom to top or top to bottom?
Well, the example you gave about University of Ibadan is interesting. People should, like you said, also join in the process as stakeholders. I give you an example of Nigerian Bar Association. We conducted the election in our branch in Lagos. We have about 3,500 voters. In the past, people will line up, queue from outside into where the ballot box. But in the last election, we had electronic voting because NBA Constitution provided for electronic voting. And in the comfort of your home, your office, even outside the country, you can vote. And that's how we voted. The voting started from 9 o'clock. By 1 o'clock, the winner was declared, and the loser congratulated the winner. So that is an example that the people should also show interest in having reform in the election by giving the larger national body example. Now, it is not also difficult for Nigeria, for INEC, to also adopt that electronic voting in our national election with backup, manual backup, so that if the electronic voting is questioned, you can use the manual voting, the manual backup to corroborate what you have done electronically. So I agree with you that it should be from both sides, from the bottom and from the top. Okay. All hands must be on deck.
Just so it doesn't seem as though I'm pushing for electronic voting alone. It's holistic, and I think you mentioned it. So let's bring in Mr. Oyekomi and find out how much we're going about this. Is this just bottom to top or top to bottom? How much involvement are people having in this such that they own the process? I mean, you have seen the rate of voter apathy, low voter turnout, and it's basically because a lot of people feel as though they're alienated from the process. So how well are you bringing in the people that will vote eventually in this reform process?
Thank you. We have regular consultations with all stakeholders. We have regular quarterly meetings with them. This electronic voting argument is a very brilliant one. And look at what we did as a commission. I said earlier that the last National Assembly promised us that they were going to conclude the amendment of the Electoral Act. And on our own side, we embarked on certain initiatives. The INEC chairman, Professor Mahmoud Yakubu, led a very strong team to the Nigerian Communications Commission and NICOMSAT to discuss the gray areas concerning electronic transmission and voting, hoping that this Electoral Act will be amended. Now, the NCC is the regulator of all the service providers. And it then turned out that there are several blind spots not covered at all by these service providers. And remember, INEC has got almost 120,000 polling units across 774 local governments in this country. So effectively, if you are going to transmit word and images, there must be enough strength in the network to be able to do that. Therefore, every polling unit must be able to transmit directly to a central place where all these things will be collated. But the service providers then told us that they don't have the capacity yet. So what then happens if we, for instance, conduct presidential election, which is one constituency, and we are not able to transmit results from all the almost 120,000 polling units? What happens? That is one. Two, there are other external factors. There is cyber security issue. We've all been witnesses to what has happened in recent time. Even with the United States election, the accusation against a particular country of interference and all of that. How do we ensure that the fifth columnists don't hack into our system to destroy the process? Because, you know, polling units are supposed to open at 8 o'clock and close by 2 p.m., and then we have all the processes at that time. How do we ensure that we protect the network across the entire polling units, across the 774 local government, throughout the period that we're going to have this election? That's another issue. So, unfortunately, the Electoral Act could not be amended, so we had to revert to the existing law, which still emphasizes manual conduct of the election process. So we are as enthusiastic as Nigerians are. Nigerians have expressed a lot of hope that this type of system could be adopted. But we also need to look at the pros and cons of electronic voting, because it is not as easy as people think. You have to provide infrastructure. There has to be electricity. You have to look at the way weather functions. If rain starts falling, for instance, depending on the time of the year that the election is held, what happens if there is a meltdown on the network in a particular part of the country? So even for the smart card readers that we use, we have to take, according to the area of strength, the different networks that are strong in the different areas of the polling unit. Take Osun, for instance. In Osun State, when we conducted the governorship election, we discovered that there are different areas of strength for the service providers. Where one is strong, the other one is weak. So we had to now understudy the areas where a particular one was strong, and we took those SIM cards for that particular area, and then the other place where another one is strong, that was what we did. So it's something we are open to, and once the will is there, once the law is amended, once the infrastructure is provided, we will go ahead and adopt electronic voting.
Well, Mr. Yekomi, before you come back to Lagos, the question that Kaude asked is, is it from top to bottom or bottom to up? By that, I assume that he's talking about how much we are carrying the generality of the people along. For instance, one of the main functions of INEC is to conduct voter and civic education. Another one is to promote knowledge of sound democratic election processes. Was there a challenge in this, in the execution of these functions of INEC? Because I'm thinking, even if we have reforms and these functions remain in the purview of INEC, what's the assurance that INEC will still be able to perform this and not ask for another reform in a short time from now?
Thank you. Look at what we did when we launched the continuous voter registration exercise. Recall that as of 2015, the total number of registered voters was just a little under 70 million. Then we embarked on continuous voter registration exercise in the way prescribed by the Electoral Act, really continuous for the first time. And within that period that we carried out the CVR, the number of registered voters increased to over 84 million. So we added about 14 million new registered voters to the register of new voters to the register of voters. And we also embark on what you call voter education. Yes, it is the duty of the Commission to educate the public on the processes, and we are trying our best. We work with development partners in this aspect. The civil society organizations have been wonderful. They have done a lot of work to assist us. The political parties are, in my view, not so cooperative in this regard because, they are the ultimate beneficiaries of this process. But they are still not putting in enough effort to also educate their own members on this issue. For instance, the ballot papers that we used in 2019 is fundamentally different from the one we used in 2015 because of the large number of registered political parties that we had on the ballot. Before the ballot was designed, we consulted with all the stakeholders. We called the civil society organizations, we called the political parties, we told them about our plans. We showed them a dummy, and we had a lot of input. We also displayed the ballot boxes and how the ballot paper will be rolled, because now, because we now have more political parties, it's longer, and there are 3 columns. So how do you fold that and put it in the ballot boxes? We displayed all of that, and we embarked on rigorous voter education exercise. We adopted radio programs because we reckon that a lot of people have access to the radio, and we also organized workshops, we organized meetings. But you know, we can only do so much in a society like Nigeria that is so huge, that is so big, and we don't have enough funds to do the much that we need to do. But like I said, we got a lot of assistance from civil society organizations. We got a lot of assistance from development partners. And I think that the social media platform also helped a lot, because young people are very active on the social media, and the interactions and the suggestions we got, we also make good use of them. So we are trying our best from our own part, and we'll continue to do so.
All right, Mr. George, so one of the ways in which we introduce you is the word public is included. So talking about the public, how well entrenched do you think the public is as far as sound democratic doctrines are concerned?
Well, you know, sometimes I remind people that the Stone Age didn't end. It didn't come to an end because people ran out of stones. The Stone Age ended because people invented metal and led eventually to the Industrial Revolution. By the same token, if we really want a transparent and credible electoral process, we will see light at the end of the tunnel, not darkness at the end of the tunnel. Our friend in Abuja has mentioned the obstacles, you know, to an electronic exercise. There are no obstacles that we can't overcome. If we want to make sure that we have extensive telecoms penetration across the country in order to have credible electoral process, we will do it if there is a will. So what is lacking, I'll come to that. What is lacking, I think, is that there is no political appetite to have credible and transparent electoral process, because it favors certain key political actors at the moment. That's number one. Number two, you know, the common people, the generality of Nigerians do not have a problem freely and non-violently choosing their leaders. In fact, if you see the initial images that come from polling units all across the country, you see that people simply file out, you know, peaceably to conduct the electoral process. It is at the point of actually voting that you see all kinds of disruptions happen by political actors. And it is at the point of collation, when the people have already gone home, that you find a lot of fraudulent practices happening. So my sense is that the ordinary people, the common Nigerians, are already ahead. They want a free and transparent electoral process. It is the political actors that have not been able to guarantee this. And my point is that we can actually have extensive internet and telecoms penetration across the country to make sure that we are able to conduct electronic voting.
Okay. Mr. Ngige, there is the general notion that our electoral processes need critical reforms. Are you, by any chance, suggesting that INEC should be unbundled?
No, INEC should not be unbundled. I don't know whether you are still referring to the electoral offenses, because it has never been the duty of INEC to handle electoral offenses prosecution.
No, yeah, I mean, that's the responsibility of the police.
Yes.
And according to him, they have investigated and they have given them file.
To the police. So when that commission is created, they will handle everything. But the question you asked about electoral reform is, there's no doubt about it, that we need serious electoral reforms. And it will not start and end with electoral acts that they are pursuing now at the National Assembly. There is also need for constitutional amendment. For instance, he has mentioned about the number of political parties, 91. which country conducts election with that kind of number? My take is that the Constitution, I don't know why the previous attempts to amend the Constitution did not include provision in the Constitution for registration of political parties meeting national spread.
Let's continue on that conversation about political parties when we come back from this break. Please stay with us. Mr. Rotimi Oyekomi is in our studio in Abuja, CPS to the INEC chairman. Mr. Austin Tam George is here with us, a public analyst, as well as Mr. Emeka Ngige. We're discussing electoral reforms in Nigeria.
Now, just before we went to that break, you were talking about political parties, but I'd like you to add to this. There's always that question about who benefits from a faulty electoral system. And a lot of people say it's the political parties or political actors. So while we're pursuing the reforms in different areas, should we also ensure that this reform puts in, more accountability from political parties such that they are more accountable, whatever it is, whatever infractions they engage in are, should I say, punished appropriately? Should we also enforce that in these reforms?
Yes, I agree with you. There was a particular country, I've forgotten the name of that country, in 2008, where the political party engaged in rigging of election, and the matter went to their appeals court. In nullifying the election, the court proscribed the political party. That was it. Proscribed the political party in the judgment based on what they have done in the election. I recommend it for this country.
But then the onus of proof is usually very heavy, because that's one of the things that the police say, is a major challenge that they have had to contend with. How do you prove that somebody actually committed without evidence?
The onus of proof does not require climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. Beyond reasonable doubt, it's provable. When you have particularly those that are documentary, or even the violence that you see with aid of video, people now record things as they happen. So you have live account, people destroying ballot papers, chasing away, they're recorded. I tender it at the tribunal. What proof do you require again from me?
What if the political party denies the fellow?
That's why the Electoral Act provides that every political party must submit the list of their agents prior to the election.
But we also know that those that will eventually drive these reforms, let's be fair, are the political parties. They are the ones in the legislature. They are represented there. So it's kind of tricky when you say make laws that will, in quotes, indict you eventually. So, Mr. Tam George, how do we go around this? Because they make the laws. They are our representatives at the legislature. But then also, they're meant to make laws that will, in quote, not favor them eventually. So how do we go about this?
I think we have a problem with our enforcement mechanism. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm always careful not to recommend more and more legislations, because I think we already have quite a number of laws. What we have lacking, it seems to me, is the enforcement mechanism. We do not enforce our laws. I mean, if you kill someone at the polling unit, I mean, the laws there, you don't need to, promulgate a special legislation to enforce that. I mean, to enforce a sanction. We have the laws. Do we have the appetite to have change? Do we have the will to make sure that we have a more transparent and credible electoral process? I do not think that we have that national appetite, especially at the leadership level. That is why, in the introduction, I said we need to have a very honest, non-partisan national debate about what kind of country exactly do we want. Because what we call elections these days, frankly, could better be called competitive rigging. The ruling political party, simply rigs out the opposing political party. They just try to out-rig each other. So what we have is competitive rigging rather than elections. Is this the kind of country that we want? And, the more fundamental consequence appears to be that it even affects the quality of leadership that we have, not just at the national level, but across the states. I mean, it was just last week, the First Lady was lamenting about governors receiving, billions, hundreds of billions of allocations every month. And yet, not in one state will you have pipe-borne water piped to people to drink. The quality of leadership we have in the states, in terms of governors, in terms of legislators, is so abysmal that you cannot but wonder whether it is not a direct reflection of the poor quality of choices that people make, or whether there are choices at all made in these so-called elections. I think that we've now reached a very critical point in our electoral crisis that we need to have a national debate. What kind of country do we want? This is not democracy, frankly. Democracy means a government that represents the widest possible wishes of our people. But we do not have democracy.
So what would you call
what we have is some kind of civilianization. We have civilians in all structures of power. You do not even get the sense that those who occupy political offices have linkages to the people. As soon as they get into these offices, they delink themselves from the people. And that is why even basic services, water supply, good quality education, primary healthcare delivery systems appear to be absent, despite the fact that billions upon billions of hundreds, of billions are allocated to this state. So I think that we've reached a point of national crisis where we need to put partisanship, and political acrimony aside and ask the fundamental questions about electoral reform, about voter education, about punishing people who perpetrate violent acts. There is not a single example of someone who has actually been successfully prosecuted, despite, the warfare that we see in our electoral centers.
If I can just quickly butt in, Mr. Tam George, you said the politicians, once they get into office, they delineate themselves from people, so to speak. What is responsible for that? How does that come to be?
Well, first of all, when we even have a chance to make choices, we do not make informed choices. In Finland, because of the fundamental role of education in making choices, for instance, they have given a certain amount of bandwidth of internet access to each citizen, not as a privilege, but as a right. It's covered by the Constitution that, look, it's not enough in our democracy simply to make choices. You must make informed choices. Don't you have access to information? The Constitution guarantees that you must have a certain bandwidth of, internet access allocated to each citizen so that people will have information. We do not have that here. What we have is people still tend to vote according to primordial sentiments of ethnicity, religion, and the rest of them. So when you make those choices based on these kind of considerations, the chances are that you will end up with bad leaders. And when the bad leaders get there, we do not have the sophistication of citizenship that says, okay, now that we voted, how can we establish structures of accountability? We do not have those things. So people simply, I've been in office, I know what I'm talking about.
No recall has ever succeeded.
These are things that you gentlemen believe should be encompassed in the whole reforms process.
Yes.
Well, let's there's a critical actor in our electoral processes, and we've been spading conversations about them. Well, let's deal a little with it, with Mr. Rotimi coming. It's about political parties. We got information recently that INEC is trying to have certain conversations with political parties who are, principal actors in our electoral processes. What kind of conversations are you planning to have with them? Part of the functions of INEC is to probe their finances and ensure that they comply with the Electoral Act as far as funding of electoral elections and primaries and campaigns are concerned. So what kind of conversations is INEC planning to have with the political parties?
Well, we have we consult with political parties on a regular basis. We have quarterly meetings with them, normally. We meet regularly at that level, and if there's an emergency, we also meet. And we have a good relationship. Like I said, there is not a single policy that we introduce that we don't keep the political parties in the loop. The same with all other stakeholders that we have, because you see, we are responsible to Nigerians, and anything we do in the spirit of transparency, we bring everything to the table and we discuss.
Mr. Yukomi,
they tell us the truth.
Forgive me, one moment. The question is about the finances of the political parties, or financing of elections, financing of the political parties. We believe that there were, I think there were plans that INEC was having to have specific conversations with political parties on this.
No, it's not just limited to finances. The rule about finances is very clear. You know, political parties are supposed to submit audited accounts to INEC at the end of every election. And unfortunately, since 2019, majority of them have not done that. And, you know, in the last meeting with them, the INEC chairman told them that this particular aspect is still pending, and they are encouraged to do so. But then, you know, what does the law say about the failure to do so? INEC is not interested in wielding the big stick all the time. We believe in conversation, in persuasion, and telling them, look, this is very important, this is necessary. So, like I said, the conversation is not specifically about finances, because this is well known in law, this is well known to the political parties, that it's an obligation that they must submit at regular intervals the audited accounts, especially after elections.
All right, thank you, Mr. Oyekomi. Very, very few words before we close. So what do you see us doing? What should be our priority as far as elections are concerned, Mr. Tam George? 30 seconds.
Yes, I think we need to hold a national debate.
And what should be on the agenda?
Agenda should be electronic voting. How can we make sure that we have sufficient will, sufficient telecommunication penetration to make sure that anybody who votes in the remotest corner of this country, the vote is then transmitted to a central server which will reflect the wishes of the people? We need commitment on that.
Okay, Mr. Ngige, how do we deal with electoral offenses? Because that seems to be almost like intractable.
Well, the creation of that commission is one of the ways. Create electoral offenses commission. Give them the powers to initiate charges, prosecute, brief lawyers, independent of INEC. Once they receive the cases of those involved, they charge them. Like the one that has happened in Kogi, they were killing of the woman in her house. That's the type of case that should go to Electoral Offenses Commission. They will have the power to investigate with the police, initiate the charge, and prosecute the persons involved. The last thing I need to say is that, notwithstanding the deficit in telecom, INEC should start conducting in their by-election in areas that have access to internet or to a telecom. Once the bill is passed into law, they should not wait until the whole Nigeria. It may not be possible. You cannot go and put telecom where Boko Haram is in charge.
Well, you have given INEC an assignment.
Yes, they should start doing it as soon as the law is passed. Where there is access to telecom, let them conduct the by-election or any other election there.
All right, well,
electronically.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here. Mr. Austin Tam George is a communication public services consultant, a former commissioner for information in Rivers State. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Mr. Emeka Ngige, Chairman, Council of Legal Education, thank you very much for your time, as well as the Chief Press Secretary to the INEC Chairman. He joined us from our Abuja studio, Mr. Rotimi Oyekomi. Thank you so much for your time. The conversation continues after now. Please stay with us.